In this video, we're going to go over the first and second dynasties of ancient Egypt. Now, the second dynasty lasted approximately from 2890 to 2686 BC. Now, I should state right away that the second dynasty is one of the least understood dynasties in the annals of ancient Egyptian history. The evidence is very meager, and that is especially the case for the first 4 to 5 pharaohs. Now, there is also quite a bit of disagreement about the chronological order of the pharaohs in the second dynasty. Now, the best way to think of this is there's consensus on the first 4 pharaohs, and there is consensus on the last pharaoh of the second dynasty, Khazakemwy. But it is in the middle where things start to get a little bit murky. Now, you can see here these two columns. One column has what Egyptologists think is the chronological order, and then you have Manetho's king list. Now, you remember Manetho is the Egyptian priest who came much later on, of course, during the Macedonian rule over Egypt, and it was Manetho who put together all the dynasties and provided the list of pharaohs. But some of those names Egyptologists have not been able to verify in the archaeological record. So if you look here, you can see the name Kyries. But Egyptologists have found no evidence of that in the archaeological record. Now, the best guess is that Kyries is in fact Seth-Peribsen. So where did Manetho get these names? Well, did he make them up? Well, no, he didn't, but he might have had access to materials that Egyptologists have not discovered in modern times. And so again, it's quite unclear about the names and the chronological order. Now, if you take a look at this name on Manetho's list, Neferkyres, Egyptologists can't associate any name in the archaeological record with Neferkyres. So it's quite unclear where this name exactly came from. Now, this doesn't mean that at some point in the future, Egyptologists won't be able to unlock some of these mysteries in future finds. And that's always kind of the exciting ongoing research about ancient Egypt. Now, the two pharaohs that we have the most information about are Seth-Peribsen and Khazakemwy. But it is Seth-Peribsen who we are going to focus on in the second dynasty. And so we will talk about that pharaoh in the next slide. Now, Seth-Peribsen's reign was around 2740 BC. And one thing that has greatly intrigued Egyptologists is that he took the name Seth instead of Horus as his patron deity. Now, you will remember that most of the early pharaohs chose the deity Horus as their royal protector. And so this is very, very strange. And you can see right here this image, which we looked at in the last video. This is the symbol of Horus, and it is this falcon-shaped symbol that appears in most of the seals of the early pharaohs. But if you take a look at this Syrinx found in Seth-Peribsen's tomb, there is no symbol of Horus here. This is actually the symbol of Seth, and it has been called the Seth animal. I guess they are not exactly sure what animal this is. And so Egyptologists have tried to understand why Peribsen chose Seth. Now, an original theory about why this occurred was that Peribsen was committing heresy and that he sought to introduce a new state religion that involved around Seth. And that in turn, this caused some sort of large civil war in Egypt over the state religion. Now, lately, this has been largely discounted by modern Egyptologists. And one major problem with this original theory is the fact that several other deities have been found on several seals inside of Seth-Peribsen's tomb. And so, as I said, the idea of Peribsen as a heretic has largely been discounted today. Some Egyptologists actually think this was more of a political maneuver rather than some serious attempt at altering the state religion of ancient Egypt. Now, a seal found in Seth-Peribsen's tomb contains an entire sentence written in hieroglyphics, and that is the earliest sentence written in hieroglyphics that archaeologists have found. Okay, let's move on to the third dynasty. Now, the third dynasty is where things really start to get going in ancient Egyptian history. It is the first dynasty of the Old Kingdom. Now, you'll remember from the first lecture I mentioned that kingdoms represented a period of great prosperity for the Egyptians, and there were 3 kingdom time periods in ancient Egyptian history. And so this is the first kingdom, the Old Kingdom. And what we start to see are the very first pyramids. And so there is this expansion of Egyptian architecture, and so that represents a greater access to materials, greater wealth, and the list goes on and on. Now, the third dynasty, similar to the second dynasty, also has a chronological problem, but it occurs at the beginning of the dynasty rather than the middle. And that involves exactly who the first pharaoh is of the third dynasty. There are 3 primary lists that have been discovered in Egyptian archaeology. There is the Turin king list, there is the Abydos king list, and there is the Saqqara tablet. And those are named for where they were discovered. So the Turin king list was discovered in Turin. The Abydos king list was discovered in Abydos, and the Saqqara tablet was discovered at Saqqara. Now, as you can see, there is a dispute between these three lists about who exactly was the first pharaoh. The Turin and the Abydos king list have Nebka as the first pharaoh and Djoser as the second pharaoh. The Saqqara tablet has Djoser as the first pharaoh. So it is unclear exactly who the first pharaoh was of the Third Dynasty. But what is clear is that Djoser is the most famous pharaoh during this dynasty, and usually you will see his name prop up in the top 10 lists of the most famous pharaohs of all time. And he is associated with the step pyramid. And so he is the first pharaoh to build a pyramid. And we'll talk about that in the next few slides. But before we move on, you might be wondering, what do these lists have to do with the Manetho list? Well, Manetho was probably pulling his lists from some of these archaeological artifacts that have been found. And probably he was formulating his list from the Turin king list. But we can't be exactly certain of that. Nonetheless, remember, it is Manetho who created the idea of the dynasties. These lists here just have a straight list of the pharaohs, but it is Manetho who starts to divide up the pharaohs in terms of dynasties. So let's take a look at the progression of ancient Egyptian architecture. Now, we talked about in the first lecture, in the pre-dynastic periods of ancient Egypt, Egyptians were buried in just simple open pits. And then in the first and second dynasties, mastabas start to appear. And those are these single-level, flat-roofed structures. In the third dynasty, we see the very first pyramid, the step pyramid. You can see that in this image right here on the right. And this was an amazing upgrade over the previous mastabas. There was nothing really like this in the ancient world during this time period. And it was over 200 feet tall. And so it was the largest structure during this time period. And this is why the third dynasty is where things really get going for the Egyptians. I mean, you would have needed a large labor force, a greater economy, and even greater access to materials such as stone to build a structure like this. And this was built out of stone rather than mud brick. And we'll talk about the construction of this pyramid in a few slides. Now, this was intended to hold the mummified body of Djoser. But unfortunately, like other tombs in ancient Egypt, it has already been looted. But interestingly enough, they did find the mummified left foot of Djoser in this tomb. Now, the step pyramid was built at Saqqara. Now, let's take a look at a map of ancient Egypt so I can show you where Saqqara is in relation to other ancient Egyptian sites. Now, Saqqara is located on the map right here, and Abydos is located down in southern Egypt on the map right here. Now, we talked about Abydos in the last lecture as the place where the first pharaohs were entombed. Now, during the first dynasty, there were some nobles that were buried at Saqqara. But as far as we know, none of the pharaohs were actually entombed at Saqqara during this time period. Now, during the second dynasty, some of the pharaohs built their tombs at Saqqara, and some built their tombs at Abydos, so it was sort of split in half. By the third dynasty, Djoser chose to build his step pyramid at Saqqara. And the second pharaoh, who was likely his son, also chose to build a step pyramid at Saqqara. Now, this made sense for a few reasons. First, Saqqara was right next to the capital city of Memphis. And you can see this on this 18th century map right here. Here is Memphis, and here is where Saqqara and the step pyramid are located. So it was a shorter distance for the pharaoh to travel to oversee the progress on his tomb for his busy afterlife. Remember, pharaohs had two primary functions. First was to oversee the Egyptian state, of course, but also they were very much involved with the building of their tomb. Now let's talk about the construction of the step pyramid. Now, if you take a look at this image of the step pyramid, you can see that it's 6 levels high. And these are actually 6 mastabas built on top of one another. Now, there is some debate about whether these actually were intended to be mastabas stacked on top of each other because of the way the stone was cut. And the stone for this step pyramid was cut very differently. Nonetheless, as I said, it was one of the tallest structures in the world during this time period. Now, the architect behind the step pyramid was a man named Imhotep, and he was Djoser's master builder. Now, Imhotep was a man of many different trades. He was not only an architect, he was a physician, a scribe, and an astronomer. And so he was sort of the Leonardo da Vinci of his time period. And he was so important that he was later deified as a god. And so he had an enormous impact on Egyptian architecture. Now, you will remember in the last video, I talked about how the burial chambers for the mastabas were built underground. And that is the same procedure that was used for the construction of the step pyramid. All of the burial chambers are underground. And they are hidden in this elaborate maze of tunnels. And that was probably to confuse future grave robbers. robbers. In the end, of course, this maze of tunnels did not stop the grave robbers. They were successful in looting it almost completely. But as I said, archaeologists found the mummified left foot of Djoser in one of the burial chambers. Now, the step pyramid was actually part of a larger complex, and so it is surrounded by several temples, and originally there was a 30-foot wall around the entire complex, which today is pretty much gone. Now, Djoser, like many pharaohs, sought to associate himself with stars because stars were seen as eternal. And so the North Temple, which is called the North Temple because it's on the north side of the pyramid, faces the North Stars. And so it was thought by doing this, Djoser could join the North Stars in eternity. Okay, so we've seen this progression from mastabas to the step pyramid. We're not to the Great Pyramid of Giza, but we're almost there. And we're going to get to that in the next dynasty, which is the Fourth Dynasty. See you guys then.